One ring.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Find yourself a comfortable seat. My name is Tracy, and I completely agree that this place is magical. I don't know where your magic group went, but I'm with you. I lived here for almost 5 years, first as a student at MSLS and then as the director, and this is my 6th year with the Art of Hosting training here. And this being the last time we get to do it in this building is kind of double magical. This is going to be moved in a new building built, so enjoy every moment in this magical space. We'll have a celebration at the end. The face looks really terrified. Yeah. So one of the things that really helped me put together the sides of me, the side that just wants community and people to work with and people who understand this way of thinking, and the side of me that had to teach a master's degree about it, was to understand some of just the basic foundational patterns that underlie the reason why we work this way. Once I knew that, there was incredible freedom to use it. And once I could explain that to a CEO or a government official or my department director at BTH, things became possible that weren't previously possible because there was some kind of logic, and it was based on actual research. These are real patterns that have been researched for many years, that have been actually not created but noticed. Just sort of noticing something that's naturally happening and putting a frame to it so that we can see it and make it more visible. So a lot of what we do this week is going to be kind of just lifting those invisible things up to the surface and saying, there it is. It's kind of simple. And it creates that freedom to change the way we think about doing things, from how we relate to each other to how we work to how communities function. So the first pattern I want to show you, anybody need academic referencing? Let me just check. I saw a lot of university people. Not too many, a little bit? Okay, we'll talk later. There's not enough of you to go for it. So the first pattern to think about, there are probably 100 different iceberg models in the world. This is one of them, right? Everyone has an iceberg model. This iceberg model is really about how culture forms itself in an organization. And so that squiggly line, of course, is the water line. Since we have a water theme, that worked well for me. And the only part of it, the iceberg we see, is the part above the water. Yes? And that part is, how do people behave? Right? What do we see actually in everyday life? What are the systems that we create, the structures that we create? You know, government systems, institutions, all those things. That's the only part we see. But actually what's supporting that and what's driving that are the values underneath. But just under the waterline, what is it we care about? Because we really only do what we care about. If you don't care, you kind of don't do that task, or you don't join that group, or you don't take that job. If you don't care, the behavior won't follow, right? But underneath that, even deeper at the bottom of the iceberg, is what we call worldviews. Like, what is it that actually shapes the way I think about the world? And the funny part is, we all kind of think that everybody believes the same thing that we do. So whatever my worldview is, of course, is the way the world works, right? Which then, of course, is not really true. And so, if you're trying to change behaviors, we see all kinds of behavior change projects around, everything from dieting to organizational change projects. And we work at this level of behaviors. When actually, change happens all the way down at the bottom of this pyramid, all the way down where our worldviews sit. I'm going to ask Isabel to hang this up really high while we check out what do we mean by worldviews. So we have one and the other one under it. Feel your tallness. So the worldviews we're going to look at in this case, I think I will show it first. You want to hold it? Yeah. There are two worldviews that we want to look at that are most most common in the kinds of cultures that we come from. Anybody recognize this one? Does anybody work in one of these structures? Yeah, or go to school in one of these kinds of structures? Yeah? Or live like in a family that has this kind of structure? Yeah? Yeah? I heard that from a lot of people as I did these trainings around the world this last year. It's really common structure and it works really well for machines, right? It's a really mechanistic system. It has very strict rules, who gets to talk to who, how information travels, what you're allowed to do, what you're not. And it's really common. We use it all the time. And there are places where that's appropriate. The thing is, we aren't machines. I don't know about you, I'm not so good at following other people's rules for very long if they stop making sense. Because we're living systems, right? So I can look out this window and I can see, no offense, BTH, a mechanistic system, because institutions function that way. You have an organizational chart. But I can look out this window and I can see a living system. A system that functions just as well, probably more efficiently. It adapts to change more quickly. This one doesn't adapt to change all that quickly. I can attest to that, having been there for a while. This one will adapt to change every day. Every day. It changes a little bit. Something big comes through, it can adapt. And it's because it's shaped more like this. It's less about the structure and more about how the relationships between the parts function. Okay, so the relationships between all these parts that can move and sway as the water moves and the wind blows allow everybody to remain connected in the system. This one doesn't move so well. It's fairly rigid, right? So we're going to have a little exercise just to kind of feel the difference between these two. And some of you may be familiar with this kind of living system, maybe even if you work or live in a system like that, because you are living systems. So even those of us who work in structured institutions, we still function like this as we move around inside that institution. You can't really stop us, right? You're gonna find the ways you need to do what you need to do. So we're gonna put this up, and I'm gonna ask you, we're gonna do a little movement here. So if you have things, not just yet, but if you have things with you, you're probably gonna need to push them to the side. What I'd like you to do is we're gonna stand up, and I'd like one person to stand right here in front of me at the head of the hierarchical system that we're going to build, and then 2 and 3 and 4. And we're going to build ourselves a mechanistic system. Okay, so everybody facing this way. One person here, build it all the way to the back. Move your things off to the side. They'll be under the chairs when we're done. You want to be the boss.
Pretty messy mechanism. Messy mechanism.
Come on up. 2 people, get close, shoulder to shoulder. Here, okay, we've got our vice president right here. Department head here. Close it in, tight, shoulder to shoulder, line it up. Here we go. There. Minions. Minions. Where are the peons? Right? So we've got layers and layers of people you're responsible to. Who are you responsible to?
I think you're, but I'm not sure.
Okay. But it's not really clear. And who are you responsible to? If you could attribute you, yeah.
Her? Or you? Or you? I don't know.
And you? Who are you responsible to?
2 of them.
Probably those people right in front of you. Okay, so how about you?
Yeah.
Who do you answer to? Rita? Yeah, and how about you? Nicholas? Nicholas?
Or these two?
Yeah, the C-suite here.
Yeah.
So can you come up and just, are you allowed to just come up and talk to this guy? Can you get here from there? Easily?
I can try.
But it's not really
It'll get messy.
simple for you to just move around in this system? What does it feel like kind of there in the middle? Do you have lots of freedom to do what you want to do there?
No, I really want to leave.
You really want to leave?
Yeah, there's no way out.
Feel a little claustrophobic?
Very uncomfortable. Kind of stuck.
Like, who's loving this? How come you're loving this?
Well, I'm feel quite free and I've got lots of people supporting me.
Just turn around.
Yes?
We're the experts from out of town.
Oh,
That's why we're enjoying this.
wonderful. I'm just curious what the people in the back row are doing. Has anyone snuck out for coffee yet?
We're on parental leave over here.
Oh, they're sitting down. You can't even see your people aren't working. They're sitting in the back.
We have problems.
Parental Sweden now.
You can't see it, don't worry about it. It's fine, don't worry about publicity.
Can I get some promotion?
You have to ask her. Can she have a promotion? And so she'd have to ask you, and you would have to. It's going to take a while. So how would you change the system?
Yeah, face the.
Break it! Okay, some are turning around and facing the people they work with. Walking out of the system. We got some walk out.
I still want to stand next to you. Of course, we can start moving.
Wonderful. Some kind of disruption has just happened here. I just want to check in with the boss. Give me just a minute.
And my company just fell apart.
Sorry. We have consultants, though, if you want.
Maybe I'll check with them.
So what they might suggest is let's try a different experience now. So from where you're standing, let's see what it feels like to function as a complex adaptive system, this living system, network system, that you have the autonomy to move independently, but you must maintain connection. You must maintain communication so that you can function and keep your network together. And the only boundary is kind of these lovely windows at the moment are our boundary. So what I want you to do, without telling these people who they are, I want you to choose two people in the room. Tell them who they are. Notice what they look like. Pick two people. And when I count to 3, you can move as freely as you want, and there are 2 rules. So it's a lot fewer rules than the system you just came from, right? 2 rules. Make sure that you remain in a triangle with those 2 people. Don't tell them who they are. Remain in connection, visual triangle with those 2 people. And don't bump into anybody. Because that's just polite, right? So you all are a moving system. Move about, mill about, do your work, but keep your 2 people in a triangle with you. And don't bump into anybody. Keep moving, don't stop moving. Moving and moving and moving. Keep your people in a triangle with you. See how freely you can move while you just keep connection. After, you can talk however you want. Do your work. Move wherever you want. Find 2 people. Oh, we have a little traffic jam going on here. And it ran into a hole. Oh, it's moving again. Okay. Find the people. stop where you are. Do you still have your two people? Can you point to who they are? Somebody show me who your two people are. Point to your two people. People are still looking. Most of you are pointing in the general direction of your two people. All right. All right. Come on back up, and we're going to sit down up here and talk about that a bit. Flexible?
I lost my person for a long time,
Yeah.
and I found her again, and I was so happy.
Relationship matters. I heard agile. What else?
You had to be much more aware of what was happening around you.
You had to be more aware of what was happening around
Focused
you.
on your two goals and also on everything that was happening around you.
Yes, yes. So your attention was heightened because you had self-responsibility in that system.
You only focus on two people, so it's hard to make connection.
To the rest of them, other than bumping into them? Yeah. Limitation of the game.
Felt a bit lost.
You felt a bit lost, yeah.
Difficult.
Difficult?
Difficult even with two.
Just to keep your eye on them with all those people moving.
You feel like a capable person taking responsible for staying in tune with the group.
You felt capable?
Yeah.
Nice.
Sometimes it's a lot of guesses, like, okay, I can see that person here, I know that person somewhere there, and I'm like, what's that here?
Kind of just generally, I think that there, I'm going to trust that.
Yeah.
Everyone had more or less the same space around them. Like at some point we were really distributed evenly.
Yes. And how did that feel different than this one? That you had space to move, there was space around you?
The speed change, sometimes changes happen really quickly, but that's slow.
Right. There was a traffic jam at one point. People kind of went, I can't find them, I'm just going to stop. Yeah.
Never stop like moving, and compared to the triangle, you have like, I mean, if you turn it or compare it to a business or to business, you were really focused about just recognizing the people you're focused on than everything else.
Yeah.
In the first model, I felt that we had a lot, like a big power to achieve an aim and to go for something. But like every individual didn't really count. It was just like about the aim.
Right.
And the last one, it was like more, okay, we as a group, how we interact, how we connect, and like more organic. But less like aim oriented, less like, okay, we want to achieve one single thing together.
So what you actually wanted to do mattered more,
Yeah.
but you couldn't necessarily see, because I didn't tell you what your company was about, what you were doing, right? So there may be a direction, but it doesn't look like the point of an arrow in that form. Yeah. So subtle differences and really big differences that kind of mirror these systems, right? The mechanistic system that many of us find ourselves in. And sometimes within that system we function like this. Like if you went to Google headquarters in California, looks like this, still structured like this, but they function this way. Many places are beginning to experiment with that kind of, what if we just trusted the humans in the system to be driven by their own passion and do the tasks and the projects and the innovation that they're going to do, but we didn't limit that by controlling how they could move, right? We just supported their possibility to be networked and in communication. So it's a living system. It's actually working in some places, not so well in other places, because it's still, we're still learning about it, right? How does it work in structure? You've had some experience with that, yeah? And any stories to share?
Well, I was thinking, I was a director at Tetra Pak at one point, Tetra Pak International, and we were structured in that hierarchical way, but I was responsible for environmental communications globally. And there was absolutely no way that the structure could in any way absorb anything that we were trying to do environmentally, because it in no way fit the structure. So everything we did was done through the network by people who were willing and able to participate in that. But trying to work the formal system was something I had to do after the fact to explain, not before the fact to ask permission, or we'd still be doing that.
So humans are going to find their way, right? We're going to find our way. But what if we could create systems that supported us to do that, that actually then accelerated our impact in the world, in whatever our goals and work was? So this way of working is really about that. So we're going to get into some of the models that, there's just 2 more pieces that I think help understand. Can I have you guys help with this one?
There's a lot of pieces to it. Yeah, if you'll do the stickies.
There's a lot of extra
Sorry, we needed the
writing
boss
as
who was
well.
tall enough.
Hopefully you can see this well with all the other writing here. So one of the models that helps us understand this word, so we had mechanistic systems, and this was called a complex adaptive system. And so one of the things that is important is that we actually have a shared language around, well, what does complex mean? What does that even mean if we're working in complexity? And so the Cynefin framework is a sense-making model that helps us look at what's the situation happening right now, and what's the leadership style, the leadership stance that will help us move forward. So I just want to walk you through these different situations that help inform what kind of leadership is helpful, all right? So in this first quadrant, there are 4 quadrants. It's like those 2x2 matrix, but it's not a decision-making matrix, it's a sense-making. So I made sure that it's not 2x2. I need a marker. The first one we call simple or obvious. And it's called that because the link between cause and effect, we'll put a C for cause and effect, is a direct link, right? So if this happens, we know exactly what the effect will be. If I let go of this marker, what will the effect be? It's going to hit the floor, like every single time I let go of it. I can make that more efficient by holding it closer to the floor, right? It's going to fall faster, land quicker. We always know what that pattern is, so it's a simple system. So when we're, say, in a factory, and we've figured out exactly how to get this little widget into that little shape, it's a direct system, and we can make it faster and more efficient, because it's a direct link. When there are sort of more moving parts in a system, we call it complicated, when the link between cause and effect is still possible to find, but it kind of takes a funny path, and there are some unknown wiggles and shoots that go in there. But once we find the path between cause and effect, we can repeat it and get the same outcome. So imagine, we talked about like manufacturing something here, or dropping the pen. Here might be like, yeah, we can figure out how to send a rocket to the moon. It takes a lot of analysis, a lot of experts, a lot of inputs, but once we figure it out, it's repeatable, right? We know the pattern, we can follow it again. So that falls in the complicated domain, all right? These systems are we call them ordered systems. I think there's a sticky that says that. They're ordered systems because we can see the path, the pattern of how things move, and it's predictable, right? So in ordered systems, we can use words like best practice. If it's simple, we know exactly what's going to happen between A and B, then we can actually say this is a best practice, you can use it too. It'll function the same way. That's the only domain that word makes any sense. And we use it for everything, right? And it's just not true. I'm working with huge commercial farmers along the Mississippi River in the US around best management practices for water quality. Do you have any idea how complex water quality is? 28 states and 3 provinces of water flowing into the Gulf of Mexico? Yeah, there's no best practices. There are just good experiments. In complicated systems, we can learn those things and we can hone them and make them closer and tighter, and we can get to good practice, but it's still complicated enough we can't get to best practice. Caroline has a story about, is this the Coca-Cola factory story?
Yes, so you can design, because it has to do with how do you design for a complicated system. And what you do is you design so that it can absorb some shocks to the system, but will always give you what you need. So if you're in a Coca-Cola bottling plant and the top flies off one of the bottles, you don't want to have to shut down your entire factory while you repair what's happened there. So instead, you create a system where there are a huge number of lines that feel repetitive, but what they do is they allow you to capture an hour's worth of Coca-Cola bottles getting filled and stopped, filled and stopped, filled and stopped, while you repair what has gone wrong with the thing which is sealing bottles. But you don't have to shut down your entire factory. That allows you to continue to work in a complicated system. You don't have to redesign the whole system. You don't have to bring everybody together to discuss, and now, what should we do now that the top has come off? And you still can manage through things that may have a little bit of uncertainty, but you can minimize it. So you've got good practices for doing that, and you'll see that most Coca-Cola, most bottling plants will always have these extra places to catch bottles at a time like that.
And still, every day, Coca-Cola comes off the line because it's a predictable, ordered system. When we move into the complex domain, the trick here is that the link between cause and effect, yeah, it's real, but it's over a long time frame, and you can have so many variables impacting what's happening that you can really only see the cause in hindsight. You can't actually see ahead to know what's happening. So the easy example for me, working in sustainability, is climate change. So we can look back 40 years and go, oh, carbon, damn, that was a big issue. But we couldn't see it looking forward, right? You can't, one of my friends talks about, you can put a GPS on a pigeon and you can take all the data you want about where he's been, but it's not going to tell you where he's going next, right? It's not going to tell you where he's flying next. You might get a guess. You might be able to kind of prototype, like maybe he's going to go that way. Let's send out see if we can track him. Oh, yep, he went that way because there was better food over there. Yeah, who knew? Right? So you can't predict in a complex system. So the idea of strategic planning and complexity, I'm sorry, you can't predict where it's going to go. So there's ways around that allow you to work differently and still move forward, even when no one knows which way forward is anymore. When things get so complex, we have to actually be able to see the system not only from kind of the front, but from the side and underneath and overhead, and from the third grader and from the elder and from the person being impacted and the person who we didn't even know was being impacted. And we need all those perspectives in order to see what's happening and then make some prototypes and move forward. So that's how we're going to work in complexity is quite different. So this we would call emergent practice. There's definitely no best practice. No good practice. We're working with emergence. What wants to happen? Some of you study Theory U, Otto Scharmer's work. He talks about what's the emerging future. How do we sense into the emerging future and sort of prototype our way towards that, see what's coming, send out some experiments and see which one actually moves forward, and then put all your resources into that one. But that means you have to be willing to fail on these 5 prototypes so that the 6th one actually works. So planning for failure is actually a good thing, right? Whereas in these mechanistic systems, it doesn't work that way. Chaos is when things just fall apart and there's no link at all between, right? Natural disasters, floods, fires, wars, things just, and they're very fast. And first responders come in, or the event burns itself up and it's over, and we dealing with it by moving into a complex domain where we can come around and say, okay, what do we do? What do you know? What resources do you have? And we find a way forward. So these also move from one domain into the other. And very often, the traditional sort of corporate model that believes it's a very simple, ordered system in a very complex, moving world, moves closer and closer to this, what Dave Snowden, who's developed this model, calls like the cliff falling from this domain right into chaos. Companies like Kodak, like, didn't you see that digital age coming? Shoot, off you went, right? So you can pretend like we're doing great. I'm just, we're in this arrow pattern and I'm only looking one direction. Didn't see that one coming. Company went under. Happens all the time. So if you're not attending to the complexity in the system, there is no longevity of your company. So we have one more model to show you that kind of lands why we're working in this way, this arch of hosting conversations that matter. And this is actually one of the foundational patterns for the way we work. We call it the chaotic path. And there's a continuum from control to order to chaos and then to destructive chaos over on this side. And within that, if you look at these ordered systems, very often the kind of leadership we're working with is somewhere between order and control, right? And so coming up out of that, you might know a leadership style called management. Yeah? And if you want to study management, there's a million places for you to do that. And that's a valid leadership style, and it really is helpful and needed for any part of a system that is ordered. Even these kinds of systems have parts that are ordered. We do need some order, right? So management is one style of leadership. When we're working in this space between order and chaos, which is this space of complexity in an unordered system, that's where we're actually using leadership that allows us to work with emergence, right? What's emerging, and how can we work to see what's emerging and go in that direction? And in the art of hosting, we often call that participatory leadership. Because, as we said before, we need to be able to see from every perspective in order to see what's really happening, to make wise decisions together. It's not about experts coming in to tell us what to do. There's no way an expert can tell us what to do. We need their expertise, but we need everyone's expertise when we're in the complex domain. So they line up so that when we're actually working in complex systems, we need to be working with a leadership style that can address emergence. And that's the methodologies and the patterns that we work with in Art of Hosting are designed specifically for that. And they feel different and funny because they don't teach them in management school because they don't address order and control, right? So they're just as valid, they're for different kinds of situations. And so to use this sense-making tool to actually say, what's the situation we're in now? And what's the leadership stance that's needed? And that might be both of them all day long, right? But we often only study the management side of that. So this is the opportunity to say, what's this other side that helps me deal with the parts that are too complex, that involve humans and the earth and social issues and anything that has too many variables for a single decision to move us in the right direction. Yeah? Anything else?
Yeah, I think you should give your story about the people who were dealing with a complicated issue as complex.
So I worked with a community of about 500, and they owned land and buildings that were all built when they were a community of about 2,000 people. And they were shrinking and shrinking in size. There soon will only be 200 people. And they had this huge decision to make. What do we do with our land and buildings? How do we transition? And they had been taught some of these participatory practices, specifically the circle practice. And they took it on as they're the kind of people who just love working in this community way, relational way. And but they were sitting in circle for 40 years, trying to figure out what to do with the land and buildings, and what they needed was engineers and architects and actually plans and studies to tell them what to do with that. So this way of working, the point isn't that this is for everything. That was a very complicated situation, and they needed to work with those experts to find the solution. At the same time, their entire community was going through this transition, and they were using a very, very hierarchical command and control system with the humans, so they kind of had it backwards. And I spent 1.5 years with them trying to unravel that. And we got some of it unraveled, and of course some of it, behavior sticks for quite a while. So, but they're moving in the right direction.
Could I add a story?
Yes, please.
Because this has to do with, if you're in the complicated domain, so if the issues you are working with are complicated, then you need to be bringing in some form of expertise, if you're not able to manage it yourself, to help you design something that can help things work. If you work in areas where people think that things are just complicated and they treat them like this, as a mechanistic system, but they're actually not, then you can get into very severe trouble. We have one here who I work with in Vietnam, and we've had issues, not in his factories, but in some other factories, where management has said, we are a garment producing factory. This is a simple or even a complicated system, but it's input and output. Therefore, all issues in my factory are input and output issue. But the issues that are coming up in factories have to do with discrimination, not paying overtime, harassment, not hiring fairly, all the issues that you can imagine. And the way that people try to deal with them are by saying, okay, let's establish some measures for what success looks like. And those measures, which is, are people wearing gloves because that's visible, or are people wearing their face masks, end up becoming the target. It's very complex as a system, the behaviors, why people do or don't wear something, let's say like a protective face mask. One of the reasons that they don't is that the temperatures are very high, the humidity is very high, it's incredibly uncomfortable, and if you're putting 12 hours of work in those conditions, it is not a happy thing to have to breathe through these masks, so people don't particularly like it. The second thing is that the company often says, well, actually, it's quite expensive to give everybody a mask, and they don't last that long, so it adds a lot to our costs. What's a lot cheaper is giving people those masks when it's time to do an audit. And if we really have to give them the masks more often to make sure that those masks don't disappear and end up going somewhere else, we give them out in the morning when people come to work, we take them back in the evening. Repeat the next day. Give them out when people come to work, take it back at the end of the evening. And in that way you turn a problem which has to do with how do you meet the specification for running a good factory for a Western brand, into the problem of widespread tuberculosis, because 1 or 2 people who had tuberculosis in that plant and are breathing out into this mask, and the mask is collected and then handed out, starts to spread. So if you take what is a complex system, meaning that everybody's adapting and changing their behaviors because of what everybody else is doing, and because of the requirements, in this case of a German company, and you're sitting there as the manager of a factory in Cambodia, it's a long chain of distance that you didn't think had anything to do with you, and the reason why people do or don't do things can be very complex. And the only way that you can actually manage that system is by using participatory practices to find out what's going on underneath, and how do we together help to solve that? Because otherwise the decisions become intractable. But more often than not, we use the wrong leadership practice to try to deal with these issues. Because if we can simplify everything and bring it back into the complicated, it feels as if we can be in control.